Hi, I'm Katrina McLarin, and this is my podcast, The Last Resort. In this series, I'll be talking about our journey and the restoration of Casa Nova House, a stately heritage-listed mansion built in 1861, located in the small town of Oamaru in the South Island of New Zealand. This is a story of how we changed our entire lives, trusted our gut, and took a leap of faith to live our dream. Well, welcome to the first ever episode of The Last Resort. I'm your host, Katrina McLarin, and I'm being joined today by my wife and partner in crime, Brenda Laverick. Say hello, Brenda.
Hi, everybody.
So what we wanted to talk about, and the reason that we were going to do this podcast, is we get asked a lot of questions about our journey to Casa Nova House and how we ended up in a stately 1861 mansion in Oamaru, in the South Island of New Zealand, when we'd come from Auckland and we had a very successful restaurant in South Auckland in a town called Pukekohe. So it really all did start for us when we decided to do the Central Otago Rail Trail. We had a group of friends, or we still have, who are our gym friends, which translates loosely to be the fact that actually we spent more time having coffees together after the gym than we probably did the actual workout. So we had a group of people that we were really good friends with. We made the decision to come down do the Central Otago Rail Trail. I'm sure we're the only people actually that did the rail trail and actually managed to gain weight at the end of it, because we certainly did the version on electric bikes, which meant that we basically rode to the next pie, the next scone, and the next coffee, and the next glass of wine. So we had a great time doing that, didn't we, Brenda?
Oh, it was fantastic.
Still look back at it very, very fondly, actually. So I think the rail trail kind of kicked off this journey for us. So basically, when we'd finished the rail trail, I have a very good friend of mine that lived in Oamaru called Lynn, who I hadn't caught up with years, who I'd known from my ex-radio days when I used to live in Thames on the Coromandel Peninsula. So I reached out to say, hey, we're going to be coming down doing this rail trail. Did she want to catch up? So we made the decision at the end of the rail trail that Lynn was actually going to come to Dunedin, pick us up, and then we'd sort of make our way up to Oamaru, spend a couple of nights there, and then continue back home to Auckland. So Lynn picked us up from the Dunedin railway station. We had a fantastic trip up. We stopped and we looked at the Moraki boulders. We absolutely played the tourists 100%. And then we came into the town of Oamaru and we came over the rise of the hill and we looked down towards the ocean. And Brenda made a comment that still to this day I'll never quite understand why. She said to me, I'd move here. And I looked at her and I was really quite taken back. Do you remember why you said that at the time, or what your feelings were around that?
It just felt like such a calming place. Even as we approached it, I just looked at it and it was just stunning. It just captured my attention the moment we drove into it. It just felt so calming, and I just thought I could live here. And we did.
We certainly did. Well, so from there, we drove down that hill and we went to the Victorian precinct of Oamaru. Now, I'll be absolutely first one to admit I had no idea what was located in Oamaru in that way, or that it was the most intact Victorian streetscape in the entire country. So we went down to Harbour Street, and we were sort of meandering through there. We stopped at the Harbour Street Bakery. We had a pie. And I said to Brenda, we were joking, I said I'd move for the pies. So hence the reason I've named this episode, I'd move for the pies. We got to laughing and we were talking with Lynn and we were saying how great the town was. And after Brenda made that comment, I think we'd been looking for a change.
Definitely.
Yeah, we'd been in Auckland for a long time. It was starting to feel a bit more like a rat race and not as personal as probably we were looking for. We'd been looking at rural properties in and around the area of Franklin where we lived, and we still love Franklin, don't get me wrong. We'd kind of been itchy. I think we were ready for a change, but we just didn't know what that was going to look like. So after she made that comment, I'd had the pie, and the pie was amazing, can I just say?
It was a good pie.
It was a really good pie. So after that, I pulled up my Trade Me property, and I had actually been bookmarking properties in the South Island and seeing what money as such could buy. And there happened to be 2 properties in Oamaru at that time that I had bookmarked. Now, you could call this fate. I think it was a bit of fate, but I managed to get hold of the agent on one of them, and he was able to let us into that property that morning as we were driving through. So with no appointment, no time or anything, Both these properties were located on Perth Street in Oamaru. The first one we went through, and Brenda and I, we both loved it, didn't we?
Oh, yeah, it was stunning. Absolutely
It was a really,
stunning.
really nice property, and we could see ourselves actually living here, and it was a house rather than it being a business. And I think we'd had it in our mind that we were looking for something that maybe could bundle everything together, or we could do an Airbnb or something. We were thinking a bit more of a lifestyle change. And this house was really nice. It was finished. It didn't need any sort of stress or worry around renovations or anything like that. So we went through it. Ironically, it was actually under offer. Now, this becomes relevant a little bit later on. So it had a contract on it. The second property we looked at was actually the homestead, which is quite a significant property on Perth Street in Oamaru. Quite a large property, around 700 square metres. We could see the potential. There was no question of it. We both walked through it. I don't know what you felt at the time, or were you just thinking a lot of work?
I just thought a lot of work. I just thought, well, not a lot of work. I just thought a lot of money, and it didn't flow well for me. It was a nice big house. Downstairs was really nice, but then when you went into the back end of the living quarters, it just felt cramped.
It did. I must admit, it didn't feel like it did flow. It's an amazing building that has been added onto and adjusted over time, and I think that maybe some more thought could have probably gone into the way that was laid out. But I suppose as each owner had taken it, and they had different agendas for it. So it didn't quite flow, but I could see the potential for the money. It had a hall attached to it, and what we could potentially do as far as a business. It was on a great large site section, and in what you would probably deem as the right end of Oamaru. So we we were lucky, the owner, the lady that owned it at the time, I actually felt really quite bad for her. I think she'd taken on something that was well beyond her financial means and know-how of how to fix. Even I could see there was some damp at the back of the property, and I was thinking, I'm no builder, but I've renovated a few properties, and I'm thinking this could potentially be, quite a nasty money pit, even though it was a great building. Coincidentally, a few years later, we actually ended up attending the auction of that property and bought some of its pieces. So we are actually pleased to be able to say that we actually have sort of salvaged some of the original pieces of furniture out of the homestead, and it actually now resides in Casa Nova House. But the sad thing about the story of the homestead is that it's actually, because it's not protected, it's more than likely going to be demolished for house blocks. Maybe fate works in mysterious ways. I think if we had have ended up with that property, it could have sent us broke, to be fair. So I think things always happen for a reason, without a doubt. So we finished looking at the homestead, and then we sort of meandered around Oamaru for a little while. And then we left Oamaru and sort of talked about in the car, how fantastic the house was on Perth Street. And I think it started to really get the ball rolling in my head. Okay, so we could really actually move to the South Island of New Zealand. Not that I'd had anything against the South Island. I'd only been there twice in my entire life. I'd actually spent more time living overseas and travelling overseas than I'm shameful to admit in my own country. And I just love the South Island. I love the people. I love the attitude. And I like the lifestyle that it brings. There's a different pace to it. It's very hard to put sort of into words, but I felt very comfortable, very at home. Is that what you kind of felt?
Yeah, definitely. Like when I first came to New Zealand, I ended up in Auckland, and I did a trip around New Zealand, well, going back 20 years now. And I always knew, once I hit the South Island, I always knew I'd come back here because it was just a stunning part of the world. I call it God's country. It's just so beautiful.
It is, without a doubt. So we left Oamaru. We went up to stay at Lynn's place in Oamaru for a few days. Lynn had an orchard at the time there. And it was just lovely. The weather, it was summer. The weather was beautiful. In fact, we may have been slightly misled, thinking that the weather in Central Otago would be the same in Oamaru. Not quite the case. But we had a fabulous couple of days there. We went to the beach, and it was very rugged and it was rough, and it was just something about everything. It just felt really quite magical. So we then continued on, and we flew out of Christchurch back to Auckland, back to home at that time. And we were sort of going over everything and discussing everything. And I probably had the bug, I think, at that point. When we got back home, did you ever think, okay, we're going to move down there? This is going to be an absolute possibility? Or what was running through your mind?
Yeah, I knew we were going to move to the South Island because I know you.
What is that a good thing?
Well, I have the I say things like, wouldn't it be good to have a food truck, Katrina? And yeah, she went out and bought a food truck. Well, she bought a truck and was converted into a food truck. So now I tend to think about things before I say them out aloud, because
That's actually very true. I did do that. I'll freely admit it. But it was a fabulous food truck, I might add.
If I do, she puts it into motion. She's a doer. I'm a dreamer. She's a doer.
It's very true. So we went back to Pukekohe, and at the time we had a restaurant there called Poco Loco, which specialised in tapas, and Brenda had had that since 2004. So it was kind of a little bit of an institution in Pukekohe. It had been there a long time. So we'd actually renovated Poco Loco restaurant a couple of years prior, and through that renovation we actually took on the shop that was located next door to us as well. So that actually tripled our occupancy. So we felt like the restaurant was in quite a good place, probably quite a sellable place at that point in time, and that the revenue stream had been really good and we could look at doing other things. 2 days later, when we were back in Auckland, I happened to be, as you know, my favourite pastime, looking at properties in the South Island, and I came across Casa Nova House. I'll never forget looking at it on Trade Me. Now, to be fair, we were kind of horribly misled because the pictures had been taken from a previous sale some 20 odd years ago, so it was slightly misleading.
Just a little.
Just a little. So I started looking through the pictures and I was like, oh my God. And I showed Brenda.
She did.
Do you remember that? Do you remember what sort of went through your mind at the time when I showed you those images?
I thought, oh yeah, that looks big.
It is big, 570 square metres, and it currently sat on 1 acre. When it was built in 1861, it used to be a parcel of land that was over 100 acres, and it actually was the whole north end of Oamaru. When they actually sort of charted the map of Oamaru as a town, Casa Nova features in the north end as a little square box and says Casa Nova. So really, it was the entire north end of Oamaru as far as a township was. So at the time, being the first Oamaru stone building, it would have been, I can imagine, such a substantial building. And then in 1900, they actually added an extension. And the extension was put onto the back of the house and was made of Oamaru stone at the base and then weatherboards above. So originally on 100 acres, and over the years it had dwindled down to 1, but still a really substantial property. So we looked at the property. I sent an email to the agent asking for a buying guide of roughly what the price was. The price came back and I was quite shocked, pleasantly shocked I should add, at the price. But she said that it was under contract and that if we were interested, we needed to move quite quickly on it. So ironically, 3-4 days later from having arrived back in Auckland, we flew back to Oamaru to look at Casa Nova House. We sort of pulled up in the drive. It was located in the north end of Oamaru. We made it through the gates, which were a little bit dilapidated at the time. And you can sort of see the property was very overgrown. Things had been let go around the grounds. The guttering was hanging off the roof. So it by no means did it present as this perfect picture image,
no,
as had been portrayed in the real estate imagery. But it was quite funny. I just had this most overwhelming feeling of calm, and it was almost like I felt like I was coming home. And that was as we went through the front gates. So we drove through the gates. We met the agent. We went through the front door into the foyer and then into what at the time many years ago was the restaurant. We walked through the restaurant and then behind into the layout for the commercial kitchen. All that was left in the commercial kitchen was a sink and the exhaust fan. And obviously the shell, the flooring and everything was there, but none of the equipment. And I turned to the agent at the time and I said, "Where's the contract?" And I'll never forget her face, Sue, who was a fabulous agent. She turned to us and just laughed and didn't think I was being for real.
She got to know that you meant what you said after that.
I think she did. So we there was something about it that just absolutely sang true for me. And I could see the potential in the building of, 20-something years prior to this. Now, this is in 2019 when we're going through the building. It had been set up by the Taylors and they'd turned it into a fine dining restaurant. I understand it had, I don't know how derelict it was when they took it over, but they did spend a lot of time renovating it. So downstairs was quite formal. You were sort of met at the front doors by a white-gloved waiter who showed you into the drawing room and you had a pre-dinner drink and then you were taken through to the restaurant, and it was really a fine dining experience. Now, for that time in the South Island, and even New Zealand at that time in the dining scene, that would have been a very special thing to have partaked in. I grew up in a kid on a farm in the North Island of New Zealand, and I still remember that it being quite exceptional to get a Chinese takeout on a Friday night, let alone thinking that you could go to this beautiful building, historic building, and have a formal meal in that way. And a lot of thought and detail had clearly gone into it. Even the lighting was pin spot to where that each table would have been, and a lot of thought gone into how the customer would enjoy that end experience. So I think, you could see that there had been, over previous owners, a lot of love and a lot of thought going into, what you could potentially do with this property. And, I think there was an element of realism to it too, that you can't, well, unless you have pocketfuls of money, and we don't, we certainly have had to work, and we still work for everything that we have. We're very hands-on people. It was running through my head, how could we make this work? How could this be financially viable for us? And that we could make a profit out of it and that we could live off it. Brenda being a chef and myself being sort of, a relatively good cook, but also more front of house. These things were all sort of running through our minds, and I liked the idea of being able to buy the building that our business was in. So our restaurant in Pukekohe, we were tenants. So we'd had some previous landlords that weren't great, and we had a new one that wasn't too bad. But the reality is you're sort of paying rent on something that's dead money. So I like the idea of Casa Nova and it being able to, be ours, really. What was your thoughts when you walked through that restaurant? What were you thinking?
I was thinking, oh my God, it's going to cost us a fortune. I could just smell the damp. And it didn't get any better when we walked the staircase either and got to the top. I just, But I was... you're right in what you say. When we came through the gates, it felt like home. Me being from England, it felt very English. So it felt homely to me. And the gardens, even though they were all overgrown and we had to fight our way through the leaves that had fallen off the millions of trees that hadn't been picked up, it didn't put us off. I was with you. I think you knew that. That's why you asked, where's the contract?
Well, and the other thing to point out too is that, and when you say damn, it had been closed up. The house had been closed up, and it was like a giant storage unit. So that's something I should point out. We weren't just able to walk freely through these rooms. There was boxes, and it was like it was walking into the receptacles of someone's crazy mind. There was just so much stuff and clutter everywhere. So we didn't, that first visit, probably understand the magnitude of what was actually going to be needed in the renovation. We knew it was a lot, but you could sort of see structurally the bones were fairly solid. Like the stone itself, everything was fairly solid. It just probably needed a good air out and, a dehumidifier running for some time, which we actually did do. But the other thing I think too was that with the house and the way that it lays out, the flow was really good. I think the flow was
definitely good.
You just walked your way through it and everything felt very comfortable, and it felt like it just all made sense. There was it didn't feel disjointed like the Homestead Task had felt a little bit disjointed. This was different and it felt different. And it was, ironically, it was absolutely freezing. So the house was cold. So even that didn't quite put us off. What did become very evident was that most of the doors didn't work. So there was only certain doors that we could sort of go in and out of. And the agent at the time brought up a ghost factor. And, there was all sorts of things that were sort of running through our heads and we were trying to give thought to. But when we made it to the upstairs, we went up the staircase, which is quite grand. And we went up the staircase and I remember looking up to the chandelier thinking, oh my God, that's so undersized. It's so small. And I was looking at all the detail of little things, the decor side of things. And we got to the top landing and it was painted the most horrific orange you've ever seen in your life. It was like, I know that you were not a fan.
No, it was the first thing that was painted. I couldn't live with it.
I think it was called Moroccan orange or something. It was just the most horrific colour, and it just didn't fit the house, and for us it didn't fit the house, and it something about it made me feel quite uneasy. And there was a lot of furniture upstairs that was, some of it was period appropriate to the house and some of it wasn't. So it was a real eclectic sort of feeling going on upstairs. We sort of opened up, there was a fireplace at the back and the extension in the back. Well, I suppose it would have been a lounge, but actually became our bedroom. And that was like a crematorium of pet cemetery. Inside it must have had, oh God, I hate to even think how many dead birds had come down that chimney and had perished in that fireplace. You know, even walking into the bathroom and looking at the shower, there was there was mold, and it was just, there was nothing about some of the key features that sort of was enticing. It was, you know, it was like, oh my God, this is going to be really interesting.
But the house had a calmness about it.
100% agree. Absolutely agree. So we sort of walked, we checked out, and ironically, for a house of this size, there was actually only one shower.
Yeah.
One shower, which, as we'll find out in later episodes, didn't actually work. But there was only one shower.
And a tin bath.
There was downstairs, there was two bathrooms because it had been a restaurant, so there was a male and a female toilet. Upstairs, there was a clawfoot bath, a toilet. They're ravishingly freezing. And the main bathroom upstairs had the clawfoot bath, the shower, and it also had the high back toilet, you know, with the cast iron cistern, which was great. You know, there was a couple of features that were still fantastic in the house.
And the smallest sink ever.
The smallest vanity you've ever seen. You couldn't even call it a vanity, could you? It was really just a sink.
It was just a sink.
It was a pedestal vanity. Yeah.
Made for a child.
We walked through the rest of upstairs. There was a fabulous drawing room. It had a fireplace in it that was just wonderful. In fact, that became probably one of my favourite rooms in the house. Today, that room was actually used as the guest breakfast room / lounge. There was also 2 smaller bedrooms. One had clearly been the office, and that is still my office today. And the other one, a smaller sort of 3x3 sort of box room. We just use that now as a spare room for when guests come to stay if the other rooms aren't available. Then it had a central room that opened up to a balcony, which you actually couldn't walk out on because it was so unsafe. So over years, obviously, the water had been leaking in through the double French doors off this balcony, and the flooring was rotted. One of the doors, the bottom of the French door, was completely rotted away that you could actually see straight through it, and the balcony was no longer safe to actually stand on. So it was pretty clear pretty quickly that there had been no maintenance done on this property, or no maintenance done for so many years. So the last people that actually probably did do any genuine maintenance to upkeeping the building would have been probably the Taylors 20-something years prior at that point. So the front balcony, you know, I still wasn't put off at this point, believe it or not. Then we went through some double doors that were connected to sort of like what I call the last wing, and now we refer to it as the noble wing. We opened up these double doors, which the agent said, God, whatever you do, don't shut them, because if you shut them, there was no handle on the inside. You were stuck. There was no way to get out. So that always made me paranoid when I was visiting the house that I'd end up getting stuck and trapped there and no one would know. So we went through that particular wing. And one sort of room had been refurbed a few years ago into sort of like a little galley kitchen with sort of like a small dining table, and there was a laundry upstairs. And I think the Taylors might have done that because it was a very English thing to do, to put the laundry in the kitchen, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I had a look around that and I sort of thought, oh, you know, there might need to be some reconfiguration of that room. Also in that room was a chimney that came up from the downstairs restaurant that had a more modern fireplace installed in it, quite a really good cast iron one, which we still actually have today and do actually use. But, you know, you sort of had this chimney coming up through this room. It was kind of eclectic between the chimney, the laundry, and the sort of little open galley kitchen. It was kind of a little bit odd. But next to this room was another big sort of, what it would have been a bedroom in its day, but this massive space, which was slightly even bigger than the lounge on its opposite side of the building upstairs, and it was completely derelict. I'm not even joking when I say you'd walk into this room. It had been occupied for maybe the last 100 years by pigeons and birds and all sorts of things. So you walked into this room and you looked straight up through the rafters to the corrugated roof. All the walls were completely exposed to Oamaru stone. There was no trims left around the windows. The windows were still in place, but there were no sort of sills or anything like that. It was just completely derelict. And at some point in time, it had obviously been used as a bit of a painting studio because that was still sort of, splashes of paint sort of all on the floor. And there was, old tins of paint and, all sorts of different things like that in there. It certainly wasn't appealing, but it was a great space for the room.
What about the smell?
Oh, the smell was horrific. Yes, I'd forgotten about that.
I'll never forget that.
I think maybe I was trying to block that out, actually. But there was, definitely the smell. And there was even some old mattresses up in the rafters. Oh. And I just remember when they actually did eventually come down thinking, oh, my God, you'd never, ever be able to recycle those. But to look at this house from the outside, you would never believe in a million years that that room had sat there and had not been finished. So clearly when the house was first built in 1861, it was built by an English nobleman, Mark Noble, and he based it very much upon his family home. So it looked kind of more Edwardian, I think, rather than Victorian. It's quite square, quite boxy. So the house would have been completed when it was first built, fully completed, all the rooms done and everything. So somewhere along the line, that room had become derelict and it was just never repaired or reinstated by any previous owners. So, we estimated at the time that it probably sat empty and derelict for around about 70 years. So we are the first owners of Casa Nova House since Mark Noble to actually fully complete the house again. And that's something that I'm actually really proud of, that it's not just a wing that was, at one point in time, I think in the 60s, it was... velvet drapes had been put up just to close off that wing. And then, in the more recent 20 to 30 years, a couple of double doors had blocked off that wing. So I'm actually really proud whenever I walk into that room now, because I know the work that went into it, right the way down even to matching the timber trims and everything and having knives run so that it did match the rest of the house. But the restoration that we took in there was a lot of thought went into it. And I think its beauty today is a testament to that. But at the time, sort of looking at it and seeing all the Oamaru stone, it was certainly very fascinating too. I don't know whether you sort of noticed as much. I didn't know much about heritage or about Oamaru stone at that point. But just seeing how they even filled in with the limestone mortar and what they use. They use shells, they use rocks, they use all sorts of stuff to help fill in those gaps. And the stone itself is really quite thick. This is not a facade. This is a very deep cut of Oamaru stone that was used to make the house. And you could still see all the original hand axe marks, of where they'd cut through the stone. So I can just only imagine, being the first Oamaru stone building in Oamaru and the oldest in the whole Waitaki district, it's quite amazing. What a feat to think of what they did. And, and at such height, because the upstairs, downstairs has a 3-metre stud, upstairs has a 4-metre stud, and then there's the pitch of the roof. It's quite a tall building. So, walking into that derelict space was okay. And now I'm like, well, we've got our work cut out for us without a doubt.
Definitely.
This is going to be a little bit more of a restoration than even we were thinking at the time. We finished walking around the upstairs of the house. And I just, even now I get goosebumps thinking about it. I just knew, just in my bones knew this was for us. So we sort of walked around, we went outside and sort of walked a little bit around the grounds. The irony is that on that first visit, we still had no idea that there was a whole back garden section to this property because it was so overgrown on the southern side of the building, like to the point where the trees had actually grown up and were touching the building, that there was this whole section of garden that at one point in time had obviously been quite manicured and had Oamaru stone edging and everything and, a garden ornament in the centre, and there was like stones, there was pathways. Had no idea it was there. I'm not even sure if we found that on the second visit or the third visit, but can't remember now, but it actually, was just so overgrown. And on the outside too, there was also a fountain, which is downstairs by the back door to the house, which is now the bed and breakfast entrance to the property. And the fountain, by no means was it working, but it was lovely. Someone had put a lot of thought into it a few years ago, and it was sort of 2 troughs that had been put back to back, and it was a lovely addition. Yeah, the design was really nice. There was also at the back door, there was there's a sort of a back seated area there. And there had been planted, obviously, years ago, ivy, which they'd allowed to go up the poles and climb up through the side of the building and up through the guttering. So that had caused quite a bit of damage to the back of the property, as far as the guttering was hanging off in two sections of it. And you could see that, we were unsure at that point what the status of the weatherboards at the house, back of the house were, but we knew that it was, maybe not great. And we could see sort of, something else I should mention too is that on the inside, when we walked up the staircase, you could see a couple of bubbles in the ceiling. So we knew that there had been some leak there in the past. It didn't look like it was current, but there definitely had been something there that we needed to be mindful of and maybe get checked out. So as we walked around the grounds, we sort of walked around the property. It has a car park. All the things that had been established in it 20 odd previous years was still there. It was intact, but it just all needed work to restore it or repair it or replace it. It was that kind of scenario, I think. The hedges close to the house had been maintained, so you sort of roughly knew their shape. They'd kind of gotten a bit big and a bit carried away. When you sort of went round to the more northern side of the house, there's two French doors that come off the drawing room downstairs, and the lavender was so overgrown that it was halfway up the window. And I swear to God, 4 or 5 meters, Brenda, out to the pathway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, didn't even see them steps.
No, we didn't even know there were concrete steps leading up to those French doors, because obviously this lavender, and it was so dense and thick. And I've since been told, I think we have a mix of English and French lavender on the property, and it is really quite lovely. But, looking at the one great thing that I think we did have, and I think how this worked out in the end to be probably in our favour, was even though the photos from 20-something previous years had been slightly misleading, they also gave us a benchmark of what the property should look like and how it had looked when it had been cared for and loved. So it kind of gave me a little bit of a place to start from, of knowing, certainly in the garden beds and that, well, this is how it was meant to look. And, whether we kept it, that was our decision. But, we had something to go back to say, okay, that's how that was kind of laid out. And there was a thought put behind it and it made sense. I think, if anything, I was not as put off by the house as maybe I was the grounds. I am not a natural green thumb.
Never am I.
No, so that was kind of something that to me seemed a little bit more daunting than anything else. Can I just say that we're very good friends of the owners of the still shop in Oamaru, because we bought quite a bit of equipment, because we did tackle quite a lot of it ourselves. But that first sort of visit, I think you and I went away from here. We'd finished with the agent. And I think how it had been left is that she was probably going to email us a contract. And we made that, we sort of left here. I think we would have probably gone and had a coffee and had a talk about it. In your mind, what at that point, I know we're going back to 2019, but do you remember what was running through your mind about this house?
Oh, this house. Oh my God. I was thinking money pit.
Such an English. Oh my God, you're so English.
I was thinking, I could see the potential definitely when I walked through, and it felt warm, and it was like the house was inviting us to buy it. It sounds weird.
No, I felt the same thing.
And it was something was saying, get this house. So I got the house with you. Yeah. And like you, we take risks in life, and hopefully they work, and most of the time they do. So we did it with this one, and I don't regret it one bit.
So at that time, though, that could we'd come from Auckland. I had bought what was actually the original Pukekohe police station, sort of around the 1900 weatherboard home. I'd moved back from Australia. I'd been living in Australia for quite some time, 16 years, and doing work contracts around Australia and actually overseas as well. So I had acquired furniture and artwork and all sorts of different things that were probably leading up to Casa Nova House. The house that we had in Pukekohe was very small in comparison. I think the entirety of that house would actually fit in up in one level alone with space. I'm trying to recall off memory, but it was certainly under 200 square metres. But I had it jam-packed with sort of antique furniture and art and so forth. Brenda always says that I would be a fabulous gay man, full of chandeliers and it was probably quite unexpected when you walked through the doors. So straight away, I was envisaging where everything was going to go. I was plotting out places for my artwork and for the furniture, and thinking at the time we had our cat Claudia and Coco, our beloved miniature dachshund, and thinking about how would they make the move. I knew Coco wouldn't have a problem, but I was thinking about Claudia, this would be interesting. So all these silly little things were running through my mind. And also, all my family is based predominantly in around where we live. And it had been so nice after being overseas for so long to be back home and actually have my family quite close. And that was something that I absolutely younger had completely taken for granted and was kind of excited about. It was one of the reasons that I also moved back to New Zealand, was that I could, have that connection again with family. And, we always have our moments, but, I'm very proud to say that we're a family an extended family that can get together and, have Christmas together and get together and have functions and celebrations and genuinely enjoy catching up with each other. So there was that element that was running through my mind thinking, so I've only been back a couple of years and now I'm going to move again, to the South Island and not be quite as accessible. So there was a number of things that were running through my mind. We also, at the time, my sister had a couple of young children, and which we were very close to. So there's all these sorts of things and dynamics that you're thinking about. And so I can't say that I was ever scared to make the jump. I think in my life I've always made jumps and, let go, let God type thing and gone with it. But I couldn't imagine either sharing that journey with anyone other than Brenda. I don't know whether I would have done it and made such a big leap of faith without having that connection with a very supportive partner who does let me do things like go off in tangents and buy food trucks and do things and extend restaurants and doesn't try to hamper my creativity in that way. So in that way, it's a really good partnership. But she does always like to bring me down around the budgetary elements of things and try and...
That's the English part.
Try and curtail my expenditure. So when we returned back to Auckland, I think it was pretty clear that we were going to make the move. We were going to try and buy this house. I had met with our bank manager at that time prior to coming to Oamaru and prior to finding Casa Nova, and kind of floated the idea that we were looking potentially to either sell our house and maybe get more of a lifestyle block in and around that area at that time. So it wasn't a completely foreign concept, to the bank that I was going to be making this approach. But, it was a big departure to what I'd been talking about. The year previously we'd just renovated, or a couple of years previously, sorry. We'd just, we'd done this big renovation. We had the food truck and there was all these, it seemed like there was a lot of busyness around our lives. Yeah, so we went back to Pukekohe, made appointments to meet with the bank, and that's where we'll pick it up in the next episode to see what actually happened, because that certainly was not an easy journey in any way, shape or form. Brenda, thank you very much for joining me today on the Last Resort podcast.
Yes,
and I'd move for the pies. To see Casa Nova House, go to our website, www.casanovahouse.co.nz, or check us out on Facebook or Instagram. You've been listening to the Last Resort podcast with Katrina McLarin.